Okay, good evening. Welcome to Book Talk at the Willoughby Wallace Library. Tonight, grateful to have Omar El Akkad and Dan Sheehan join us tonight to talk about Omar's book and all that flows from it. The book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, just won the Nonfiction National Book Award for 2025. Or should one be saying that Omar won the award for the book? I'm not quite sure how that works. It has also been chosen as one of the New York Times 100 most notable books of 2025. There's a touch of irony here, I think, because the awards citations are coming from the heart of the liberal establishment that Umar is breaking with. Maybe they're saying, you don't mean us, do you? Or, yes, you're right, and yeah, we've always been against this. But they've certainly wanted to recognize you. So Umar was born in Egypt, grew up in Qatar before moving to Canada. He's an award-winning journalist and author. His reporting has covered the NATO-led war in Afghanistan, the military trials in Guantanamo Bay, the Arab Spring in Egypt, and the Black Lives Matter movement in Ferguson, Missouri. His first novel, his debut novel, American War, tells the story of a country torn apart by civil war, and I have read it and I would highly recommend it. It's a fascinating book which transposes what happens on the other far side of the planet to America. And it's kind of a, makes you wonder what it would be like if all of that came home here. That book was also longlisted for 2018 Carnegie Medal of Excellence in Fiction and Nonfiction. He is also the author of another award-winning novel, What Strange Paradise. The book, in part, is doing the work of witness, the obliteration of Gaza live streaming in plain view on our various devices as we go on with the business of living, while the world, the powers that be, did nothing to stop it. But this book, Omar says, is not an account of the carnage, or just not an account of that. It is, quote, an account of a fracture, a breaking away from the notion that the polite Western liberal ever stood for anything at all. Joining Omar in this bleak conversation is Dan Sheehan. Dan Sheehan is a writer and editor from Dublin. He's the author of the novel Restless Souls, which was longlisted for the Centre for Fiction First Novel Prize. It's about young men grappling with the aftermath of tragedy, darkly comic and deeply moving. It's an extraordinary portrait of male friendship, the power of memory, and what it means to come home. It is also set amidst the siege of Sarajevo, and I was just telling Dan that that's another connection I've discovered I have with him because I did work on several books on Bosnia. So he's here. Thank you so much, both of you. Dan's writing has appeared in various publications, including the Irish Times, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Guernica, Words Without Borders. He is the editor-in-chief of Bookmarks at Literary Hub. And I am very, very grateful to have you both here. And I will now turn this over to you. Omar, I had asked Omar if he would be willing to read a short excerpt from his book, so those of you who haven't read the book get some sense of what he's saying and how he's saying it, and then we can move on to their conversation about it. Is that okay?
That's great, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for inviting us. It's a pleasure to be here. Dan, thanks for doing this. I know you got a million things on your plate, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, always.
Yeah, for those of you who don't know Dan, he's there's so many people over the last 2 years for whom my level of respect has sort of plummeted. Dan's the exact opposite. Man with a huge amount of backbone. Please support LitHub as well if you can. It's been just a bastion of sanity in the industry I work in. Thank you all for coming out. I will begin with a very short reading, which will necessitate that I open up the file on my computer, which is always the most sort of fraught part of any one of these events, hoping that that my Adobe Acrobat has crashed on me. All right, let's see. Do I have a copy of my own book?
Usually it's my Zoom, Omar, that fails me just as I'm at
I
that
know, right?
the computer explodes. And
I'm the worst prepared author on earth. Hold on a second. We're gonna see if I have a copy of my own book around.
you have a good excuse. Omar has been in 3 or 4 different countries over the last week or 2 weeks. So the combination of jet lag and I think just general event fatigue is probably very real. So
There you go. He found it.
nice.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I have a copy. Do you want me to read from it?
Yeah, exactly. That's. Thank you, Knopf, for the last minute author copies. I'm just going to read the first couple of pages from the start here, from the prologue. I don't know that there's much setup needed here. We'll see. She is fog-colored when they find her. She believes she has ended. Like porters in service of some grotesque nobility, 6 men carry the stretcher out of something cavernous, something that used to be a home. And she, a girl of 9 or 10, is whisked away. Sitting on the stretcher, dazed and bloodied, she looks off to the side. She appears to be searching. The men who carry the stretcher move with urgency, as if the doing of care, of gentleness, can undo what has happened to this girl, to this place, to the bodies yet to be dug from beneath the rubble. Someone nearby asks God for revenge. Perhaps God is here somewhere, also searching. A soldier I met years ago who made the study of industrial violence his hobby once told me the first thing that kills when a bomb goes off isn't shrapnel or fire. It's the overpressure wave, air forced violently outward from the site of the blast. What you're supposed to do, he said, is drop to the ground and cover your ears. Breathe out. Empty your lungs before the air collides with and flattens them. Of course, if you're close enough, nothing you do or don't do will make any difference at all. He said the force of the overpressure wave weakens in proportion to the cube of the distance from the site of impact, which is to say, the most effective thing you can do to avoid getting killed by a missile or a mine or a grenade is to be far away when it goes off. How do you do that? I asked. Do what? Know when a thing like that is about to happen, know to be far away. Well, he said, and trailed off. A few minutes later, he was telling the story of a freak accident his daughter had suffered as a toddler, how carrying her to the emergency room was the scariest thing he'd ever experienced. Even in his line of work, even with all he'd seen, the scariest thing. As the men carry the girl out of what used to be her home, she asks if they're going to take her to the cemetery. One of the men says, "Masha'Allah, Masha'Allah." In literal translation, the word means what God wills. A closer approximation of meaning, of one meaning, is something like, what has happened is what God willed. But English, tasked with a word like this, turns stiff and monophonic, and Masha'Allah is orchestral. To any ear that grew up on this language, it is clear that what the man means when he says this word is something else entirely, something instantly familiar to generations who've heard it spilling out the mouths of beaming grandmothers at the end of piano recitals and graduation ceremonies, and at the first sight of a newborn. Used this way, it finds its principal purpose as an expression of joy. Look at this wonderful thing God has done. MashaAllah. Language, too, forces the air from the lungs.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Omar. That's beautiful. I mean, last week I read this book, I think for the fourth or maybe the fifth time, and every time I'm so haunted by that opening. I actually have a folder on my computer titled One Day, and inside it are just screenshots of dozens of paragraphs from throughout the pages of this book. Some of them I saved because of the beauty of the language, and some because of the profundity of the sentiment, and most of them for both reasons. I really think this is the most extraordinary and important book to emerge from this horrific era, and I'm so grateful to you, Omar, for writing it, and so glad to have the opportunity to talk to you about it a little bit today. I suppose to begin, could you tell us all a little bit about how this account of a fracture came to be?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, that's far more generous than I deserve. I In very early November of 2023, my editor John Freeman was in town. He was in Portland for the Portland Book Festival, and we met up afterwards. And I was ranting and raving about this idea of not knowing what the hell my place was in this part of the world anymore. Because I sound like this, but also I have the ethnicity I have, and I have the religion I have, and the name I have, and so on and so forth. And my suspicion is that he just got so sick of hearing me go on and on about this that a few days later he called up and said, you should be writing about this. And I had sort of been writing about it. I had been sketching out. Actually, some of the things I went back and looked at this because I talk about this a lot. The sort of like I had been sketching out, and I was at one point I was like, what does that actually mean? And I went back, and a lot of it honestly was just kind of witness more than anything else. I think from early on I had this sense that a lot of this really, really heinous stuff that I was watching was going to get memory hold eventually. And it was going to be as though it never happened, as though it never existed. And so the earliest sketches, well before this became a book or even an idea of a book, were just sort of, this happened today, and this usually being just the most grotesque thing you can imagine. So I had been sketching something, but as of early November is when I started writing in a more sort of cohesive or coherent sense. And as much as I was writing from a place of rage, and as much as I was writing from a place of grief, there was an immense lightness to it because I didn't think there was a chance in hell that Knopf was going to publish this book. Like John is a pretty brave guy, and John, will go to bat for his writers and all the rest of that. But not for one second did I think that this was ever going to be a thing that went out into the world. And with that came a kind of like a sense of liberation, right? You just write it, just write what you feel. And so that's what I did for months and months. And by the very end of February, I had something resembling a draft. And over the course of sort of from the start of that first draft to the end, I realized that this wasn't a book about Palestine. It was a book about here. It was a book about the West. It was a book about the sort of performative centrist liberalism that not only was surrounding me and seemed to be enabling this horror, but to which I had committed personally for most of my life, and from which now I was sort of taking leave. And I didn't think I could sort of write a book like this without turning that vector of indictment inwards. Because I often say, I've said it many, many times, that there's nothing this book indicts or autopsies or interrogates that I'm not directly complicit in. And so it became a far more personal book than perhaps I imagined when I started. But it wasn't until the first draft was done completely that I flew to New York to meet with the publishing house, with the folks at the publishing house. And then a little while later, they decided to sort of to go with it. And that's when I realized that it would go out into the world. And by then it was too late to sort of backtrack. I think if I knew, or if I was certain going into it, that this was going to be a public-facing thing, that my natural cowardice might have kicked in far more, and I might have sort of held my punches a lot more than I actually did. So that's sort of how it came about.
I should say as well for people watching that it was such a wonderful, heartening image to see at the National Book Award, that Book Awards, this book being received the way it should be. But this is coming, over a year after it's released and 2 years after these sentiments are being expressed initially online. And if you hadn't seen some of the vitriol being sent towards people who expressed those opinions in the early months and early, year, it's hard to comprehend just how much pushback there really was and how extreme and aggressive it got. I think Omar describes his courage or cowardice in far more self-deprecating ways than I would have seen them from the outside in. But it's really, the landscape has changed, even if the reality on the ground in Palestine seemingly has not changed that much, or in the West Bank. How do you feel about that? The last time we spoke at length about this was about a year ago, and we talked about this overriding sense of hopelessness and horror, especially being parents of young children in what we feel to be, quite a morally decayed place. Now it feels like the sentiment of the majority of the population has changed, which is heartening. But there's something terrifying about policy and the real life application of that sentiment being at such a distance. How do you find that? How do you square those two things?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, right? And it's going to be a really unsatisfactory answer, which is sort of doubly frustrating because I've thought about this a lot. I've spent a lot of time thinking about exactly the sort of thing you're talking about. Because there feels like there's this sort of disconnect, right? Where I'm seeing more and more people become unable to turn a blind eye to what is happening. Both in terms of, to be perfectly honest, the number of bodies that have piled up, and the account after account after account of atrocity. Also independent of that, but also simultaneously tethered to that, the conditions predating the last 2 years. People starting to realize that there is this part of the world where certain people have to take different buses and have to carry different ID cards, and can only walk down different roads, and so on and so forth. That there is a group of 2 million human beings who live in an open-air prison and have for decades. But as all of that is happening, there is also a kind of increased recognition that nothing that happens to those people over there, wherever over there might be in any moment in history, remains over there. These drones are coming to your local police department, just like the light armored vehicles from Afghanistan and Iraq came to your local police department. First time I saw light armored vehicles in my life was in Afghanistan when I was covering the NATO invasion. The next time I saw them was in Ferguson, Missouri. So I think these things are causing an increased sort of recognition of what is happening. But at the same time, it's very easy, particularly given the kind of circles I travel in and the kind of book I've written. I'm surrounded by folks every time I do an event, who generally are in this place, right? And it's very easy for me to then start to believe that this is the overwhelming tide. And it might be, right? At the ground level, it might be. Everywhere I go, there's thousands upon thousands of human beings who are vehemently opposed to this. But then at the same time, all I have to do is take a look at the institutions and the systems of power where I live to see how glacial this movement is. A lot of this book is an indictment of this sort of performative centrist liberalism. I also live in Portland, man. I often say in this town, you can go to neighborhoods where every house has a Black Lives Matter sign on the lawn. There's not a black family for 20 blocks in any direction, right? I know where I am. I was talking to a friend of mine in Portland who was instrumental in trying to get the Portland Book Festival to cut ties with one of its chief sponsors, which is a bank that's heavily invested in weapons makers. And there had been some traction, the people had signed an open letter, there seemed to be support at the actual festival, so on and so forth. And we were talking about this event where Kamala Harris was coming to talk in Portland. And obviously, look, I know there's probably people watching who are huge Kamala Harris fans and whatever. I'm not trying to change your mind about any of that. I don't care. To me, there was an element of, geez, this sucks, right? This is a person who was a member of an administration that I consider directly complicit in genocide. And I was talking to that friend of mine, and I was saying, there was something heartening about seeing the protests, And he said, yeah, absolutely. But you should also know that this thing sold out in about 30 seconds. The tickets went out and were gone in 30 seconds. So you should remember. And I try to remember that whatever the hell it is I'm advocating for, or wherever I've ended up ideologically, as much as I might think that it's this growing movement that within many parts of the society I live in, it's not at all. And this, I think, relates to the first thing you talked about in terms of this book gaining traction, whether it be the National Book Award or otherwise. I've been thinking about this a lot because there's much, much better books that didn't win that award, and there's much better writers that have never won that award. There's better books about this subject matter that won't win the award. And I think for some bizarre reason, I just ended up in this spot where I suffered far less than braver writers, better writers, writers who have spoken out more. I think it has to do with a number of things. I think it has to do with the fact that I sound like this, and that the book is written from a point of view and written in such a way that it doesn't feel far away when a reader in this part of the world picks it up. There are better books that are written by people who haven't marinated in the heart of the empire. And so there's a sense of distance, and that sense of distance, I think, doesn't exist with this book. The other part of it is I think I'm right in the middle in terms of the ladder or hierarchy of literary fame or recognition or whatever you want to call it. There's writers who are earlier in their career and who haven't had as much success as I did going into the last 2 years, who decided to speak out and their careers were destroyed. Whereas I was selling enough books that maybe I was insulated from that to a certain degree. And there's writers well above me on the ladder who decided that because of their recognition and because of their following and because of how much what they have to say sort of reverberates, that they were going to shut the hell up. And I just happened to be in that middle place where I was not nearly successful enough that it mattered. Nobody knows who the hell I am. But also I had enough of a career track record that I was a little more insulated than these writers whose careers have now been destroyed. And sorry, I'm rambling here, but what's sort of even more frustrating about all of this is that I know in a few years' time, a lot of these folks whose careers were destroyed are going to be venerated, right? We're going to talk about their bravery and standing up and so on and so forth. But that doesn't change the fact that their livelihoods were pulled out from under them because they spoke up too soon. Whereas these folks above me on the ladder are going to be able to write the most beautiful books 20 years from now about all that terrible stuff that happened. And so I think it's just my very roundabout way of saying that I ended up lucking into a particular situation where the effects on me personally have not been nearly as cataclysmic as they have been on people who spoke out more, spoke out earlier, and spoke out with more eloquence.
Well, I think, even saying that, I think one of the things that what your book has done and what your public stance has done is that it has created a protection for a lot of those writers that we're talking about. I mean, for some of them who were shut down and sort of all but blacklisted early on, the climb back is so steep and so difficult. But I think what this book has done is allowed an awful lot more people to speak out and to take that stance and to say, yes, like, I see myself and I see all of us in this. And I think that's invaluable. I mean, it's the kind of work that could be done by, we talk about some of these big name authors like, Stephen King or Margaret Atwood, people with huge social media followings, people who regularly engage in political discourse online, who will, dedicate chunks of every day to, calling out the kind of atrocities inherent in lots of Trump administration policies, as is their prerogative, and who have been completely silent. These are people with kind of cross-medium clout, and what I mean by that is that they have 5 or 6 different movie and TV adaptations in the works, and so they have a different kind of power, and they can provide a different level of protection. Now, when they don't step up to the plate to do that, it's up to other writers to do it. And I know that's not the first thing that enters your head when you're writing something like this, but I do genuinely think it has created a pocket of space for other writers and other creatives to talk about this and not get fired, not get blacklisted. And how long that will last, I'm not sure. And I was wondering what you think about kind of on that. We're seeing this groundswell of support, this grassroots support for Palestine. I think if you were to poll, the adults of the world, I think you'd find an overwhelming majority of them sympathize with the Palestinian cause. And that, is very heartening to see. But by the same token, institutions now are kind of gathering their resources in order to shut that down in ways that we haven't seen before. I mean, I'm thinking of Barry Weiss, the very pro-Israel blogger, being installed as the head of CBS News. Universities across America bending the knee to Trump and the Trump administration's definition of anti-Semitism, and billionaires like the Ellisons, who are creating a near monopoly of news and entertainment media and who are very vocally pro-Israel. And I suppose my question would be, do you think the swell of support among among the populations of the world for the Palestinian cause is at the point where it's enough to combat that kind of institutional might, and what they seem more nakedly than ever committed to putting back in place?
It's a fascinating question, because the cynic in me wants to say no. I don't think. I mean, across the board, institutionally, we're talking about organizations and institutions that have massive resources. Whereas, on the other hand, we're talking about folks who, will take to the streets of London and then get arrested for holding up a sign that says, "I support Palestine Action," right? Like, there's an immense asymmetry of power and asymmetry of resources, and asymmetry of narrative justification, right? We quite plainly live in a world where a senior citizen holding up one of those signs in London can be arrested under the sort of narrative umbrella of terrorism, which is absurd, absolutely absurd. Whereas at the same time, virtually nothing the state does would ever be described in the same way. Because the whole concept of terrorizing or terrorism is precluded by the fact that this is the state operating. There is no amount of violence that could ever be described under those terms. And so there is a deeply cynical part of me that thinks that we are so far away from that condition you describe. At the same time, I think there's a lot of folks who are coming to the understanding that one of the narrative frameworks of colonialism, every instance of colonialism in history, is that this particular case is a special one. And so don't worry about it. This is all confined to this particular location and this particular moment in history and won't bleed out. And of course, one of the obvious truths of every instance of colonialism in history is that of course it bleeds out. Of course it's not a sort of unique condition. It never is. And so one of the interesting things that that happens every time I go talk to younger folks, go talk to high school kids and college kids. I call them kids, but because they're half my age. But is that when I go into these meetings, or these talks or whatever, I'm never trying to convince these folks of anything. One of the first things I tell them is, look, I'm not here to try and change your mind about anything at all. And it's almost a moot point because their minds are not going to get changed by me. They're so far ahead of me. They don't find anything remotely revolutionary or profound in this book. They're far, far ahead of any of it. And part of that is because I think that those generations and the generations to come are going to have a much harder time buying this notion that any instance of mass injustice is contained within specific borders of any kind. They see it across the board, right? Up until my generation, maybe, there was this sense that if you kept your head down and you didn't make too much trouble, not only would you avoid punishment, but there would also be some kind of reward. The house in the suburbs, the two-car garage, the life that in every material sense would be better than your parents' generation. Not only is the punishment for speaking out and speaking your conscience becoming more severe, which you can see plainly in how a lot of these colleges have brutalized the students that they're supposed to protect, but also the reward component is plummeting. You're never going to afford a house. Also, the planet you live on might become uninhabitable because of how badly we have screwed things up. And so when that punishment-reward dynamic is falling apart completely, it becomes a lot harder to buy in and to keep your head down and to shut up about something that deep down in your soul is absolutely wrong.
Mm.
So I'm seeing that as well. The thing is, nothing those kids do, nothing my book does, nothing you and I do individually is going to compare with the resources that any one of these corporations or institutions or governments can do with a snap of a finger. And so I'm trying my best to recognize the immense asymmetry while simultaneously recognizing that there's a lot more folks, particularly younger folks, who are looking at this structure and coming to the conclusion that, not to be crass, this is complete bullshit and I can't be a part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the more ludicrous aspects of sort of the Democratic Party machine of late is seeing, this party, this institution that's supposed to represent resistance to this encroaching or arrived fascism, trot out talking points that are so wildly outdated and explanations that are so flimsy. I mean, seeing Hillary Clinton at a conference tell the young Jewish population of America that you've all been tricked and you don't understand that these are fake videos, or blaming sort of the abstract idea of TikTok for why millions of Americans are appalled and horrified by seeing these images. It feels almost as if they're not trying anymore, and maybe they're not. Maybe these are figures in the party that are so close to full retirement that towing that line that was handed down to them is easier than engaging properly. But it does feel like there is a wave of refusal, and it made me think of what you talk about in the book, active resistance and negative resistance. And I was wondering if you could explain to us a little bit about those and what you mean when you talk about those two different types of resistance.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I was watching the same thing you were talking about. This, when Clinton was talking about you've been tricked, and that's been a sort of recurring talking point among a lot of folks in political power, especially. And at once, it's the laziest possible thing, right? I mean, it's sort of that line from 1984, right, about the party's final directive, to basically convince you that the thing you're seeing with your own eyes isn't happening. And on the other hand, there's not a day that goes by, if I'm being honest, there's not a day that goes by that I don't wake up and wish I was being tricked, I would much rather have been tricked this whole time, even if it means that I've written a completely meaningless book and my career's over. I would take that in a heartbeat over having seen tens of thousands of children slaughtered. I mean, I feel the same way about climate change, right? There's not a day I wake up and don't hope that 90% of scientists on the planet were wrong, so that my children will have a livable planet, right? This notion that this is a fun thing that we've all glommed onto because it's the cool thing to do. I mean, it's absurd, and it's soulless. It's ghoulish.
Yeah, it feels incomprehensible that anyone could buy into that idea, and yet it's the answering machine message for so many of these establishment politicians that you are caught up in a fad, and you're thinking to yourself, this would be the most soul-crushing, depressing fad anyone could ever want to be a part of. It feels, it's insanity-inducing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take up rave culture, right? Like, there's lots of fads that I'll happily hop on board. You know, and look, I mean, I think it comes to this notion of that, and again, what this book is overwhelmingly concerned with is not the person who believes what I believe, and it's not the person who's directly opposed to me either. I suspect there's people on this Zoom call who might be listening to every word coming out of my mouth and disagreeing with it vehemently. And maybe you are in favor of what's happening. That's your call. The book overwhelmingly, and a lot of my frustration, is with that weird middle ground of folks who don't have any opinion at all, who have just decided they're going to ride this one out because there's some kind of personal consequence to speaking up. And I know I should be more frustrated or more angry or more antagonistic toward the person who directly sort of disagrees with me, who holds the opposite viewpoint that I do. But I know where I stand relative to that person, and they know where they stand relative to me. It's this squishy, diaphanous middle ground of people who have just decided, no, it's unsafe to say anything. And so I'll wait. And this is infuriating in a way that I know is unreasonable, but I can't help it. Anyway, to get at what you were talking about, this notion of active versus passive resistance, I think in any situation of injustice, there's always a kind of asymmetry of power. Whether it's minorities getting killed by cops in this part of the world, whether it's the decades-long injustice in Palestine, whatever. There's always an immense asymmetry. And so whenever I'm thinking of how to oppose something of that magnitude, I'm thinking along different avenues of resistance, and I'm thinking fairly pragmatically. Where is the asymmetry less glaring? So when I think of physical violence, for example, I'm thinking of the immense asymmetry between the state and the individual. The state has much bigger guns, and it has the narrative justification to use them under any circumstances. And then it's expected to police itself to make sure that it did so justly. None of that is afforded to the resistance. Whereas, for example, leave-taking and negative resistance, the idea of boycotts, the idea of refusing to participate in the silliest things, right? A literary festival. There was a literary festival in Arizona. I decided not to go because one of the chief sponsors was a weapons maker. Did that suddenly free Palestine? No, of course not. But it's a thing. And generally speaking, the asymmetry is less glaring in areas of negative resistance because the state has a harder time punishing you for the things you don't do. Even though in this country there are all kinds of laws passed, or that people are attempting to pass, that legislatures are attempting to pass, to do exactly that, to punish people for not participating. But it's much more difficult. And it's not that I think that one of those forms of resistance is more or less justified or more or less effective than the other. I think all of it exists on this spectrum. and people decide where they want to exist on the same spectrum. It's that when I tend to look at these things, I tend to look at them in terms of that asymmetry of power. So love, solidarity, joy, those are also asymmetrical, but they're asymmetrical in favor of the individual and the community rather than the state. The state has no idea what to do with solidarity across what are assumed to be borders of ethnicity, borders of life experience, borders of religion, which is how you end up with a politician telling Jewish folks who are opposed to this that they've been tricked. Because this person cannot conceive of solidarity across those lines. It's impossible for them to come to terms with it. And so that's how I tend to think of these things. Is joy enough? Is love enough? Is it? No, it's not. But it's an area where the centers of power have less and less of an idea what to do against this. And so that's how I frame it, but I think other people will vehemently disagree with me and say, no, this avenue is where we should be focusing all of our attention. Those people might be right.
One thing I wanted to ask you with regards to this book and how you approach the writing of it, the way in which language has been deliberately contorted and mangled by Western media in order to obfuscate Israel's war crimes is something which I think has driven us all a little insane. Like newsreaders saying things like bullets have found their way into a child's skull, or buildings have exploded on their own, or this idea that bombs and aid trucks have almost become sentient. And one of the things I appreciated most about this book was the way in which you highlight and excoriate this extreme misuse of language and then actively write back against it. How important was that reclamation of language for you in the writing of the book?
I mean, for me personally, it was hugely important. And probably I assigned it far more importance than most other people do because of what I do for a living. I spend all my time working with words. And so, of course, I'm going to obsess over that. But I also think that it is a fundamental load-bearing beam when it comes to every form of injustice. The physical violence can't exist in a vacuum. It needs other forms of violence to hold it up. And linguistic violence is one of the central load-bearing beams in that regard. This is not new. This has been going on for a very long time. When I was writing my first novel, this book called American War, I went to a British high school. We did not study American history at all. And I was trying to read up on the Civil War. And at one point I came across this book that had a list of all the nicknames that the Civil War had during the time and in the years following. And one of my favorite ones was the Late Unpleasantness was one of the names of the Civil War at the time. The term collateral damage, I believe, dates back to Vietnam at least. But there was this period in the beginning of this century, which I think was pivotal in establishing the present-day norms of linguistic malpractice. During the War on Terror years, I think there was such a refinement of this particular kind of violence. And some of this stuff I saw firsthand, and a lot of it I talk about in the book. I talk about going to Guantanamo Bay to cover the military trials. And one of the sort of central memories in my head of that time is walking around the prison camps. And when I ask the soldier a question, I ask him, so when do the prisoners... And when I get to that word, he stops me and he says, "We don't have prisoners here, sir. We have detainees." And it was very, very important to him that these be detainees, not prisoners, because prisoner implies a prison sentence and somebody has to define that. Detainee you can just hold forever. And of course, you see that in all kinds of it. You see Palestinians held in administrative detention. Interrogations that were called reservations. The heightened use of terms like collateral damage. When those prisoners in Guantanamo Bay went on hunger strike to protest the conditions of their detention, they didn't go on hunger strike. They were said to have engaged in asymmetric warfare because the prison guards can't go on hunger strike back. So it's asymmetric warfare. And it would almost be funny, right? If the consequences weren't dire, this is cartoonish almost. But the sort of opiate effect this has when you're not directly invested in the violence, when you're not the one pulling the trigger, when it's being done in your name and on your behalf, but you don't have to do it. The sort of anesthetic or opiate effect of having this language to wrap this all up in is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And even if you don't give a damn about Palestinians, you should know that this is happening every single day around you in so many contexts, right? Every time there's an officer-involved shooting, or a bullet finds its way from a cop's gun into the head of a black man, you're going to hear the same language and you're going to hear the same effect. You're going to feel the same effect. It's not incidental. It is a direct component of how the world comes to be the way it is. And particularly for journalists, who are the central conduit by which these events are then described to the public, the second you engage in this, the second you employ this kind of language, you're not doing bad journalism. You are doing the opposite of journalism, which is immeasurably worse. And the most frustrating part is I think most journalists are smart enough to understand this. But they're also smart enough to understand the consequences if they try to break from it, which is how we end up with some of the most monumentally terrible journalism I've ever seen in my life over the last 2 years.
Staggering, isn't it? I think the one that jumped out at me most recently was the exchange of, well, what they called hostages and detainees after the most recent sort of quote-unquote ceasefire, that children who were rounded up to be used as bargaining chips in later ceasefire negotiations were called detainees or prisoners. And a soldier was described, who was being held by Hamas, was described as having been kidnapped from his tank. Now, no one in the history of combat journalism has ever described a soldier being taken as a prisoner from a tank as being kidnapped. And yet this might have been the first time it was ever committed to print. And then I saw that repeated again and again and again until it becomes the norm in those discussions in that week. It's surreal, but that's how it went.
Yeah,
I'm going to just pause. I'm just going to just pause for a second. I'm just going to let people know that if they've got questions, they can ask them now. We can continue, but I just want people to know that they are free to ask questions if they have any, because I don't want to hold you here too long. So carry on, and I would just, folks, if you've got questions, please unmute yourself when you want to, and you can also, I could start your video if you want to have a face-to-face, but carry on. Yes, I'm sorry, just wanted to intervene and say that.
No, thank you, Ruby. And I should say as well, for those of you who haven't read Omar's novels, one of the sort of fascinating ways in which some of what we're talking about is presented and communicated through this different medium is after I finished reading this book, I went back and read American War, which we spoke about a little earlier. And I think you've spoken about this before, Omar, how some of the descriptions of massacres in refugee camps in this dystopian United States, they're absorbed by readers who say, like, where did you get this extreme, could this ever happen? This is insane. And he would say back, well, this is basically a beat for beat description of the Sabra and Shatila massacres of Palestinian refugees in Lebanese camps in 1982, or this politician in the book, the speech he makes to kind of smooth over these atrocities, it feels so nakedly insincere. Do you not think that that's, whatever it might be, a little bit clumsy? And the response to that would be, well, this is almost verbatim what President Obama said in a similar situation. And so I think sometimes it can take a different medium to kind of fully bring home the lunacy of some of the language that's used around these atrocities, and trying to communicate to people here in this very safe and cosseted landscape what it must feel like to be on the receiving end of this kind of extreme violence, and then to see it massaged and sanitized away into something that can fall off the front page of a newspaper. It's terrifying, but I think it's a testament to the artistry that Omar has, that there are all these different ways of communicating that to an audience.
Do we have any questions? People?
Joe,
Yes.
do you wanna unmute yourself?
Joe, do you want to unmute yourself? There you
I
go.
did,
Go ahead,
yeah.
Joe.
I didn't do any research on this, but when was it that we started using the term terrorism all the time? Did that come out of George W. Bush after 9/11, or did it exist before?
Again, from my very limited experience, the term obviously predates well before the George W. Bush sort of war on terror years. I think some of the central changes that happened with regards to that term happened in the first 2 decades of this century, by which I mean not so much the term itself, which obviously has existed for a very long time,
Yeah.
but rather the legal underpinnings and the legal connotations. And so what you end up with, and I'm this is a huge overgeneralization, and I apologize for it, but the sense that when that term is employed, a certain set of what would otherwise be considered the legal norms that we have had for a very long time can suddenly be set aside.
Yeah.
Which is essentially, when you think about a place like Guantanamo, that was the heart of the Guantanamo quote unquote legal system, was this ad hoc court system where, for example, hearsay evidence was allowed, secret evidence was allowed. So if I'm charged with something, I don't get to know who is providing the testimony against me. Indefinite detention, so on and so forth. And this obviously was glaring under George W. Bush, but it happened under Obama as well. And this notion that any male between the ages of, I think, 15 and 65 who is killed in a drone bombing or whatever it may be is by default considered a terrorist until they're proven otherwise posthumously. So it wasn't so much that the term appeared out of thin air, this millennium. It's that the tethering of it to some incredibly destructive policies and ways of thinking about the law and ways of thinking about what's normal and what's acceptable came into place over those 20 years. And that has had immense repercussions, because once you do that for one concept, there's nothing to stop you from doing it for every concept, which is essentially what we're seeing right now. Concepts of freedom of expression can be thrown out the window because there's a specific case, and so on and so forth. So that's what I suspect happened, but I am not a legal scholar by any stretch of the imagination, so please take that with a grain of salt.
Thank you.
I think on the terrorism question, what's so worrying about the last few months, Omar mentioned earlier the prescribing of Palestine Action in the UK as a terrorist group, so that any public support of that group, who I should say their kind of day-to-day activities involve vandalizing and dismantling the machinery involved in Israeli apartheid or in the genocide in Gaza. So it's not. They break into empty factories and vandalize fighter jets, things like that. But we're seeing over here as well the Cop City protesters, eco-protesters in Atlanta being charged with terrorism. We saw somebody jailed for 6 months in Texas for spray painting a wall because it was a pro-Palestinian action. So these are all ways in which the normal laws and the normal commensurate punishments are suspended. So when we think about the necessity of these actions, I think if you took a poll and you asked people, is it necessary for us to fight back against these great existential threats like climate change in any way we can that doesn't involve hurting people, I think the average person would be on board with that. But actually, from a government perspective, their incentive is to crack down on these actions in as extreme a way as possible, so that groups like, say, ELF or the Weathermen in the past, so that these don't repeat themselves, because that really puts a spanner in the machinery of this large capitalistic enterprise. So the idea of trying to encourage a young person to kind of fight back in a way that feels very necessary is now a lot more fraught, because you want your 18, 19, 20-year-old to be part of this resistance to these different movements. but you don't want them to sign up for an action that will get them convicted of terrorism and thrown in a black cell for 20 years. And so that's that sounds dystopian. I don't think we're fully there across the board yet, but we are certainly tilting in that direction.
Anyone else?
This is Carolee Hall. I agree with the conclusions of the book and have for some time, long time. And as an older person, I'm equally concerned about how to have the populace of the United States respond to what I believe is genocide. And I can only say that in the olden days when I was young and disputing the Vietnam War, I have the opinion that what made that protest viable politically was because when the draft affected many, many, many middle-class people, suddenly it became an unpopular war. Apart from the moral issues involved, or political issues, however you may think about it. So that the only thing because the likelihood of that happening is slim to none in this context presently, the negative suggestion that you brought up is what I really believe young people should be considering. I believe that the young people I hear from, their parents mostly tell me about what their opinions are, which are largely in my neck of the woods, against the destruction of Palestine. And so the economic possibilities about protesting that, it seems to me, have not been properly put forward. And it isn't for me to say because I have no idea, but surely because we have such a disgustingly commercial society now, that in fact, if large numbers of people stopped buying certain goods, that indeed there might be some recognition that there is an opinion out there that might be against what's happening as we see it. Forgive me for being so, I mean, it's an elementary idea. And when I read your book, I was so depressed because, of course, it's right. And where is the answer? We all have to have the answer. And the answer is the most important and difficult thing. So thank you for writing the book, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Carolee.
Much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time to read it.
All right, so I don't know if anyone else I'm going to let these guys go. I just have to ask one question of you, Dan, one brown person to another. We're here in this country. For one reason or the other, people like you and me chose to be here, come here. And you write, when we came from a part of the world where this seemed like the opposite of what we were experiencing, as you write in your book, it was everything that place was not, or you put it more eloquently. And we are here. Would we want to be somewhere else? Is that not a fair question to ask?
No, it's it's a very fair question to ask, and I've spent a lot of my time thinking about it because this is where I was oriented towards since the age of 5. Right? Like we moved to Qatar, I started going to American and British schools. I'm living in a country where all of my media is censored, where the grown-ups around me clam up and become visibly afraid should the subject matter of a conversation go to specific places because they know they might be deported or imprisoned the following day for speaking out about it. I'm seeing this. I'm seeing this from the youngest age, and then I'm looking over the ocean and I'm seeing a place that I've come to believe is the exact opposite of all of this, where no matter what the specifics of day-to-day life might be, at least I'm free to think what I want and to say what I want and to be left alone. The magnetic appeal of that to someone growing up in an environment that I grew up in, that I suspect a lot of immigrants grew up in, is hard to overstate. And so this notion that I decided to come out here and spend my time learning how to sound like this and learning the culture of this place to the point where I'm writing books in this language, that I did all of this as part of some grand plan to just come here and sort of, undermine this thing at any cost. At least to me, it's ludicrous, right? And yet, for the first time in my life, over the last 2 years, if you ask me, if you weren't married to a person from this part of the world, and if your children weren't born here, and if you didn't have a house here and roots here, would you go somewhere else? For the first time in my life, I would tell you yes. And that is astounding to me. I just got back from a trip to Jordan, right? I don't go back to the Arab world that often, but when I do, it's very, very strange to me because it's the part of the world that my blood is from. And it's the part of the world that my family is from. It's where my name is from, where my religion is from. And yet I go there and I feel simultaneously comfortable and deeply uncomfortable in my own skin. It's a very weird, jarring thing. And it's not like I don't know what a lot of the rest of the world is like. And my feelings about a place like Qatar haven't changed. It's not that I'm suddenly pro-indentured servitude as it regards to the immigrants that build the infrastructure of a place like Qatar. That's not what's changed. What's changed for me is that I can no longer ignore the chasm between the performance and the reality. And so I need whatever place I live in, and just so happens to be this place right now, to either admit what it is or to work towards becoming what it claims to be. Right now, there's an administration in power, and again, I don't care if anyone on this chat agrees with me or not. I'm not trying to change your mind about anything, I promise you that. In my opinion, there is an administration in power right now that is openly fascist. But my emphasis here is on the word openly, and I know where I stand relative to that. And if there was an administration in power that would come out and say, listen, if we're going to pretend to be a nation built on free expression and equal justice for all and respect for international human rights, then we have to work and actually do that, then I would respect that. Mm-hmm. What I can't stand is the thing in the middle, where every day for a year and a half, I hear a White House spokesperson talk to me about the desire for everlasting peace as the same administration funds endless war. I can't take that anymore. And so to go back to your question, the reason that I'm in this place is, if I'm perfectly honest, it's safer to be on the launching side of the bombs. And also, this is the culture I understand and the language I understand, and I know how to be here. There's very pragmatic reasons to be in a place. That doesn't change the fact that more than at any point in my life, I have less of a sense of what the hell it is I'm doing here, and whether I belong here, and whether I have a future here. But that's a problem for me to figure out, just as it is individually for every person who has to think about these things. And some people, quite honestly, have the privilege to not think about it at all, and more power to them, I suppose.
I think a lot of us are trying to figure out where we belong. Your book, it said, ends on a note of hope or optimism. Do you think it does? Is that it does?
I think so. I for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
One is that hope is a survival mechanism. Otherwise, you just sort of admit the state of affairs as they are. And that is incompatible with my continued survival in this place. Or, to be quite honest, because the US is the most powerful nation that has ever existed, my survival in any place. This notion of, why don't you go back where you came from? I assure you, where I came from is not isolated from anything I'm talking about. That's not how it works. The current dictatorship in Egypt would collapse tomorrow should the US stop supporting it. But also as a function of abdication of responsibility. I often say that I come from a long line of malfunctioning hearts. The men in my family don't live very long. My dad didn't make it to 60. His dad didn't make it to 60. There's a good chance I won't. Or maybe that's just a weird psychological projection on my part. I don't know. I don't care. But when you're saddled with something like that, it's very easy to become nihilistic with respect to where things are headed. Because, hey, I won't see the worst of climate change. I got 2 young kids. And the same selfish person, that same selfishness has now taken a different vector. I don't have the right to abdicate responsibility on someone else's behalf. And so for all those reasons, even on the days when I don't want to get out of bed, which are many, many days, you have to adhere, I think, to a certain kind of hopefulness, because that's your obligation if you're going to live in a community and if you're going to live as a human being alongside other human beings.
And if you have children.
Yeah.
And I think this book as a sort of totem of hope, even I think this idea of that speaking from within America and to Americans. We just published a piece that GitHub there a few weeks ago, a writer, Swedish based, who was in Belgrade with her young daughter and processing the protests in Serbia. And she writes in the piece that she carries around the book as she reads it over and over. She carries around the book and those words as a totem, that it's a way to process what's happening, and it's a source of hope and it's a source of kinship. And I think if we're going to build this movement that is trying to run a current through people across the world, it's books like this that we need. They become things we pass from one person to another, and it helps us feel more sane. It helps us feel more connected to one another, and to start building activist communities from it. So I think it's a tremendously despairing time, but I would say again how grateful I am for voices like Omar's and books like this, and for the many people who share these sentiments and tap into those sentiments within themselves through art like this. So it's always a faint hope in the face of all this, but it's not nothing.
Thank you. Absolutely. I'm grateful to Omar. I'm grateful to you too, Dan. Thank you ever so much. We live in hope, and we will find ways to fight this. We will fight this. But thank you so much for making the time, and on behalf of the library and all the people who came, what can I say? I can just wish you the very best. Wish us all the very best, all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Have a great night.